Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our weekly online training sessions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us every week and taking time out of your Monday evening to join these presentations. Tonight we have David Brown presenting. David is a dispatcher and a primary care paramedic with BCEHS. He'll be talking about the dispatch system, but I'll let him explain exactly what all that entails. Before we begin, just a reminder to keep your mics off while David is presenting, just so we don't hear you eating chips or anything in the background. If you have a question, as in the past, please put it in the chat box that's down here. I will be monitoring the questions and saving them for whenever we do our question and answer period. So type them in there. I would ask that you please refrain from trying to answer the questions that are being asked of David in that box there. It just makes me get lost in all the things that pop up in there. So type in your question. I'll give you a note when I get it, and then David will address them in the question and answer period. As always, these videos are being recorded. You'll be able to find this video in the next few days on our YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch this one or check out any other one, we'll be sending out the link to that again. And with that, I'll hand it over to David and we'll get started.
Thank you, Anna. So as Anna said, my name is David Brown. I started with the ambulance service almost 5 years ago now as a primary care paramedic. And then about 2 years ago, saw the light and moved into dispatch. So I've worked in both our Vancouver and Victoria Dispatch Operations Center. And right now I work in the Victoria Dispatch Center. We're going to be talking about a couple of things tonight. We're going to do a little bit of an overview around the technology behind 911, the technology behind 911 systems. We're going to talk about how BC Ambulance does our call taking and how we triage and assign calls. We're going to talk a little bit about just types of responses and then the clinical response model, which will make more sense. And then we'll touch very briefly on the end just with some other agencies that we work with outside of the ambulance service to try and provide calls. So just a couple notes so you guys to be aware. I'm gonna play a couple 911 tapes from here. These are all training calls. None of them are real calls. Nobody's personal information is being portrayed on the screen. Nothing is being given away there. They are, certainly one of them is quite realistic. It's nothing particularly disturbing, but just be aware. If the idea of listening to something like that makes you uncomfortable, there may be a period of time where you just want to move away from this. And then while I'm presenting information around BC Emergency Health Services and Priority Dispatch, in this case, I'm not here speaking on behalf of or presenting for either of those agencies. And obviously, it's 99.9% factual and very little opinion, but any opinion in here is mine and not any of those. So starting off with the very basics, who answers 911 calls? So when you call 911, the first thing that happens is it's routed through the magic of the 911 system to what's called a public safety answering point, or a PSAP. And so once upon a time, when you phone 911, your landline or your cell phone would tell the computer what municipality it thought it was in, and then you would simply be routed to the appropriate local police department. And that's where you would get the queue operator saying, 911, do you require police, fire, or ambulance? And previously, almost every individual local police agency, so Victoria Police, Vancouver Police, Saanich Police, Abbotsford Police, ran their own public safety answering point and then routed calls appropriately. What we're seeing now is a shift more towards centralized larger PSAPs, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a few slides. In BC, about 64% of 911 calls are for police, 31% are for the ambulance, and a pitiful 5% are for the firefighters. And that came from Ecom 911, which is the largest public safety answering point, or PSAP, in the province right now. And like I mentioned earlier, that's the queue taker. So the queue operator is going to basically ask which service they need to go for. And that person is sitting there with a phone with 3 buttons on it. It says police, fire, and ambulance. And they say 911, do you require police, fire, or ambulance? And then they press the appropriate button and transfer you through, and they rinse and repeat up to several hundred times a day. And those are almost all people who are also trained as police call takers, doing a mix of the work. And then the call taker for the appropriate service will gather information related to the call. For some agencies, especially smaller police agencies that also answer 911, so also act as their own PSAP, a lot of the time the queue operator will also just take the call if it is a police call that way. So Ecom 911 is a private agency now that answers almost every single 911 call that happens in the province of British Columbia. They have two centers, one based in Victoria here and one in the Lower Mainland, where they answer 911 calls for everywhere highlighted in orange on the screen. And they also provide centralized police and fire dispatch services that are contracted by a lot of different municipalities for that. So they dispatch huge swaths of the Lower Mainland police. They dispatch huge swaths of the Lower Mainland fire departments, as well as fire departments all over the Lower Mainland and central interior. For BC Ambulance, we have 3.5 dispatch centers. So the one I work at currently in Victoria, we average almost over 350 911 calls per day. Our Kamloops Dispatch Operations Center is responsible for almost 500 calls a day, and Vancouver is responsible for over 900 calls a day. So here in the Victoria Center, we're responsible for all of Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and then a few other smaller communities up along the coast on the north, including Powell River and Bella Bella. The Vancouver Operations Center deals with the Lower Mainland all the way from Pemberton out to Hope, as well as the Sunshine Coast. And the Kamloops Center does everything else. So essentially the entire mainland that's not the Lower Mainland, and as well as Haida Gwaii and the Northern Islands as well there. We do also have the Patient Transfer Coordination Center, who manages air ambulance and a lot of other redheaded stepchildren that don't fit nicely into one particular center, such as the transfer fleet in the Lower Mainland, community paramedics across the province, and a bunch of other services that way, as well as being the centralized location for booking transfers in between facilities. They also manage our air ambulance and quite a few other resources. So when you call for an ambulance, what happens? What are the steps there? So we start, the public safety answering point, or the PSAP, transfers you through to a BC ambulance call taker. The ambulance call taker is going to start with the address or location and then the phone number. And they're going to go through and confirm both of those twice by having you repeat it that way. And it seems frustrating a lot of the time, especially when you're calling and you're maybe not as certain as where you are. But we always start with the address and we always start with a callback number, because we have to know where the ambulance is going. We can have a perfect call other than having a good address, and it's completely useless because we don't know where we're sending the ambulance to. And similarly, as I'll talk a bit about some of the stuff that comes up on our screen, but phone numbers that come up on our screen are not always foolproof. And so we want to make sure we have a number to call somebody back if the call disconnects. Once they have that basic information, they'll triage the call using our standardized tool that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then they start providing instructions over the phone, either to provide life-saving care or simply just what to do in preparation for the ambulance to arrive. And then as soon as the call taker has sent the call through, and while they're giving the instructions, the dispatcher who's sitting in a separate seat is reviewing the call and dispatching it out. So sending the right ambulances, sending fire if that's required, and coordinating resources that way. So like I said, the basic call information that they're going to start everyone with is just the address of the emergency and the callback number. And those can be easier or harder depending on what's going on. So it's all based on a piece of information that's called the ANI-ALI. So it's the automated number information or automated location information. So in theory, this is the information that's put through by the computer that comes through on every 911 call. So in a perfect world, and most of the time it does provide us the phone number being called from. Every so often it has issues there. And then if you're phoning from a landline or a hardwired phone, it's going to give you the address that phone is registered to with the cell company. And if you're calling from a cell phone, it's going to give a triangulated location. So triangulation or radiolocation is a fairly simple seeming idea that's actually very, very complex. But essentially a cell tower knows how far away from it a cell phone is, but not where in that circle. So we can see this image has the actual formula for calculating it out, and it's quite confusing, but I couldn't really find a better picture, and you don't want to suffer through my MS Paint skills of me trying to make a better picture. So this is the best we're going to do. But if we look at our point B1 in the top left there, we can see there's a circle around there. And so tower B1 knows that that cell phone is somewhere in that circle because it knows how far away it is, but not what direction it's in. And the same, then tower B2, it has a different circle and it knows how far it is. So it can uses all these different circles coming together and finds the point where they all overlap, and that's where the phone is. And then it takes that information and it gives it to us in a distance saying, I'm sure about this to 5 meters, or I'm sure about this to 20 meters. And it gives us the location with an uncertainty. There's other technology coming down the road as part of next gen 911, which is the sort of next big thing. And it's scheduled to be rolling out in BC over the next 2 years, where GPS enabled smartphones will actually, as part of a 911 call, they'll report their own GPS location through the 911 system. And hopefully that'll provide us much more accurate and much more effective location information, but that is still a work in progress. So with this automated location information, especially from cell towers, there are some issues. So the biggest ones is that the uncertainty, so basically the margin of error on the location it gives can be quite large depending how good the connection is and how many towers it connects to. So our average 911 call connects to 7 or 8 cell towers, and that's because it's kind of connecting off of all the cell towers in the area. So if you're on if you're on Rogers, it's still going to get location information off the TELUS towers. So often you'll see quite a bit of coverage in there, but it still can be quite large. I just came from work today and I took one call that had a 15-kilometer uncertainty, which is a little bit too big of an area to really provide useful information most of the time. And the other thing, and it seems a little silly at first, but that doesn't provide height. So if all we have to work with is a location, we can have a 2-meter uncertainty in the middle of a 50 floor building, and all of a sudden we've got a huge range of areas that we'd have to search through, versus a 5-meter uncertainty in the middle of a field. That tells us much more. We're pretty confident we know where that person is. And so because the location information and the quality of it is so dependent on the number of cell towers, you really start to see where you're going to get better and worse coverage. So a place like downtown Vancouver, this is a map of every single cell tower minus the ones that TELUS lists because they're kind of cheating, but I won't dig into that. But this is functionally almost every cell tower in downtown Vancouver. And so you can see, I think there's almost 70 to 80 of them in there when you include a few that don't get shown on this map. So we're quite likely to have a good connection and do quite well there. But now all of a sudden, if you live in Squamish, we're working with 5 cell towers for the whole area. And so it's just much less likely that connection between the two, that you're going to get a good connection there, which is going to give a good one. And then God help you if you live in Valemount, where you're going to, again, there's the 1 cell tower for the entire region, which means a lot of the time our location information is just off that 1 cell tower, so it's going to be quite imprecise. And 2, it's all context related as well, and I'm going to talk through a few ideas and a few sample calls essentially here. So for the people in Victoria, you'll probably recognize this area, but if this pops up on you and it says you have a 20-meter uncertainty, so basically this call could be in a 20-meter circle around this block. And I can tell you from looking at that map, that's a block of buildings with a fair number of them being 2 to 3 stories, but not huge buildings, and a large number of people out on the boulevard in the middle there. That's a pretty good idea of where we're going. Like 20 meters isn't that huge. We've got a pretty solid idea where we're looking. Now for our Kamloops folks in the room, how about here? So all of a sudden we've got a 30-meter uncertainty to the Thompson Rivers University residence buildings. And all of a sudden that 30 meters isn't particularly useful because we've got a general idea probably of what building it's in, but nothing beyond that. And then we move from there to downtown Vancouver with a 50-meter uncertainty. And all of a sudden that is a huge area because that pin is right in the middle of a park surrounded by high rises. And so that could be in probably one of half a dozen buildings, all of which are 15 to 20 stories. And so that pin all by itself doesn't actually provide us that much information, which is why you'll see call takers again and again, especially in cities or areas like that, really focusing in to make sure we're getting the exact location all the way up to which corner of the street people are on. Because if you're calling in a call for Main and Hastings, for example, that's a large intersection with 8 lanes in each direction, a large number of people outside, and it's quite chaotic and difficult to get around. So if the crew's driving towards that and they know they're going to the northwest corner in front of Pigeon Park Savings, they know exactly where they're going. Whereas if they're going to Main and Hastings and looking for the person who's going to flag them down in the green shirt, that's less useful for them. And then the same information that way for festivals, so that sort of thing, at a more St. John ambulance context, the call taker is going to spend sometimes more time figuring out exactly where on the property you are and where you're going to be meeting the ambulance that way, just to make sure we're sending the ambulance to the right place. Because like we were saying earlier, we can have the best call information in the world. We can know exactly what's wrong with this patient. We can probably have them diagnosed over the phone. But if we don't actually know where we are and the ambulance spends 20 minutes driving around on a festival property trying to find anybody, that's not actually particularly helpful because we've wasted a lot of time. Whereas we could have spent 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning of the call exactly nailing down where the call is coming from. So again, if we take this 50-meter uncertainty and all of a sudden we get this showing up on our screen, these are the calls you just know you're going to be in for a bit of a long ride on. But you take this and you zoom your map out a little bit, and all of a sudden you have a 50-meter uncertainty in the middle of Garibaldi Park. Obviously, we're not going to be sending an ambulance to this, but this is going to be giving us a pretty good idea. 50-meter circle in the middle of a park, as long as they don't go anywhere, is actually a very good location and it's something I'd quite easily put a call up to. So that's why it's so context dependent. 50-meter uncertainty in some areas is a terrible piece of information, whereas here 50 meters is actually pretty useful. So that's most of what I have down here for the technology around 911. But I'm also very cognizant that I deal with this stuff every day and a lot of it's very normal to me. So I want to take a quick pause just for questions here. If anybody has questions they want to know about any of this sort of thing. I think I saw one there already.
I've got some of them written down here. I'll just go with them. From the top, the first question was, what happens when you say all of them when asked for police, fire, ambulance, or if you don't know?
So that's what really, and that's really the queue operator's job, is sorting out who sends who it goes to. There's some convention. So generally speaking, car crashes or motor vehicle incidents, they're going to get police, fire, and ambulance all responding, but they're downstream through to the ambulance service because most of the time we're the ones taking the most pertinent information. So we're the ones that are going to be asking questions about injuries. We're the ones that are going to be asking questions about, is the vehicle on fire? Is anybody trapped in the car? So we do some basic screening for the fire department, but we're getting most of the information that way. For something like an assault in progress, that's going to need police and the ambulance service. But because the people who need the most information there are the police, we pass the police will take the call and then just give us a phone call to let us know we're going. And similarly for a house fire or a car on fire, the fire department are the one that need the most information there. So the call is going to go to them and then they'll give us a phone call manually just to let us know, hey, can you come along for this call? And similarly, if you don't know, basically just describe to the queue operator what's happening and they will say, okay, hold for so-and-so, or I'm going to put you through to so-and-so, and they'll help you understand who you need to talk to in that moment.
Cool. Next question, someone asks, can you give coordinates like off of a GPS?
Yes. So it's for any call in a metropolitan area or any call that has an address, we always want to get the address and not the coordinates. Because coordinates in a city or anything but essentially a search and rescue or backcountry scenario are the least useful way of trying to find somebody. So in this case, call takers become really, really good at Googling. I had somebody a few days ago screaming to me that they were at the Burger King in Surrey. And I think it was maybe like a 200-meter uncertainty. And so we have a general idea of what circle they're in. And I managed to find the Burger King they're at. And then we can find the address through Google and work with it that way. For backcountry calls, a lot of the time we will have people, especially if we have a less good uncertainty, A lot of the time we will have people use either the compass app on their phone. A lot of backcountry folks use trail forks, and that gives us about as precise as of a GPS coordinates as they're going to get on their phone. But the problem is, in general, people calling 911, especially in a backcountry scenario like that, aren't always the most calm, cool, and collected, and reading off a string of numbers all at once is quite challenging for a lot of people. And so it's not always, it's something we try to avoid, but in certain situations, it's just the right answer and the best way to get the information.
Cool. Does triangulation consider altitude? Say you're in an upper
No.
floor apartment or a skyscraper, and how does it work for a mountainous place like North Van or other?
So I will be the first to admit that triangulation beyond the very basic explanation of it is not something I know a ton about. It does not consider altitude. And so, like I said, with the skyscraper, I could have a pin 2 meters, I could have a 2 meter uncertainty in the middle of a skyscraper. And I know exactly, I could probably tell you which corner of that skyscraper it's in, but I couldn't tell you if it's on the first floor or the 50th floor. It doesn't give me any information that way. For mountains, I mean, it is all generally line of sight, but to get cell service to call, you have to, generally speaking, have line of sight to at least a cell tower, which is where we get that information from. So if you're up on the North Shore, you're still getting fairly good line of sight through to probably a lot of the ones in downtown Vancouver, probably some of the ones on Bowen Island, and maybe even up to a few of the towers in Squamish. But as you start to get over the shadow of the first couple mountains, so you get past Cypress, Seymour, if you're getting backcountry into Garibaldi, there's poor cell reception because now all of a sudden there's mountains in the way of your line of sight there, which is why I'm just going to put my other hat on. If you're venturing into the backcountry and you're not 100% confident you have cell service, you need to carry a satellite communicator or a personal locator beacon as an absolute minimum. That's all I have to say about that, because I can do the full hour-long talk about why you don't go into the backcountry unprepared, but I won't subject all of you to that.
Um,
Anna's heard it all before.
I still haven't gotten one. Moving on. Ken asks, on cell phones, you can share your location. Can a call center receive this type of information if only one tower covers my location?
So I'm just reading through here. Can I share my location? So you're not able to push your location through to 911. We only, when you call 911, basically the computer takes a snapshot of where the triangulation says you are right at that moment. We can go through the cell companies and do, it's not quite, Miami 911 ping and we watch the little blue dot wander across the screen. But we can phone the cell phone companies and they can essentially ask the phone for a new triangulation. And so they just send it a little message asking it exactly where it is. And so we can sometimes do that if their first one's quite a poor connection and then we can't get through, we can get the cell companies to try pinging again, although it's not normally successful. And so that's where we might start to work towards, if you are in the backcountry, you don't have an address, we've tried pinging you once or twice and we're not getting good through, that's when we might start looking at getting you to provide your coordinates based off of what your cell phone is saying you are at. Because the GPS actually works off the satellites instead of the triangulation there. And that's why a really important part of the next gen 911 is moving towards using the GPS position that the phone knows to provide its own location instead of the triangulation, because that's just a much more consistently accurate way of providing location info.
All right. Nancy asks, for hikers who have a spot tracker and activate it, who does the spot response center contact 911?
So the response center for like GEOS deals with InReach. I don't know who actually answers spots. They will contact the police of jurisdiction because police are typically the people that call search and rescue, except when they're not. So they'll contact police and then police manage the file and reach through to us. So they'll call the police and then I'll get a courtesy call from the police saying, hi, we're going for a search and rescue event at this lat and long. It was given to us by Spot. Can you please attend with us? And like any thing else. There are always exceptions. Like with the inReach, you can actually send messages. And so there's some people that have an inReach at a very remote location, not because they're doing backcountry adventuring, but purely just for their form of connection. And so if they're connecting through to the inReach folks and saying that's purely a medical emergency, they'll call through to us first because we're going to be the most useful agency.
All right. If you are in a moving vehicle, are you able to follow location?
No. So the any alley that comes through is purely a snapshot of where the triangulation is right at the moment that you connect the 911 call through to the computer that does all the routing through. So it just takes that immediate snapshot. So we can do the consistent pings if we're sort of trying to follow somebody, um, which can lead to some entertaining things. Just as a side note, because I still think this is a hilarious story and you guys might not get it, but a lot of elderly folks have pendant alarms, and some of the newer ones have GPSs in them. And so the idea is that these GPS pendants, if somebody has a fall outside of their house, it still picks up. And so I got a call from Lifeline who had gotten one of these pendant alerts. So it said someone had fallen at this place. And so we sent an ambulance there, and they got there and there was nobody there. So we called Lifeline back and we said, hey, can you recheck the GPS location? And they said, oh yeah, it's actually like 5 kilometers that way. But we sent somebody over there, and crews driving around, and we're like, nothing found. So we called Lifeline back to like, yeah, it's actually 5 more kilometers that way now. And there was a crew on top of it. And it turns out we just spent 40 minutes chasing one of these that had been deactivated and put in the back of a post truck. So we were chasing a Canada Post truck across North Vancouver with this pendant in the back after the gentleman had decided to return it, but forgot to take the batteries out. But going back to the original question, no, we can't we don't see a blinking blue dot moving across the screen. We just get the location that somebody called in from.
Shan is asking, if someone calls 911 from the backcountry and they get disconnected because their reception is so bad and the range of uncertainty is like 500 meters, would anyone be sent out to go look for them? What is the threshold?
I mean, generally speaking, if somebody calls 911, it's an indicator that help is needed, and it will be followed up on. In town, the first thing that'll happen, if I'm just going to go through a couple of examples here and I'll get to your question. If in town right now, if I called 911 from my cell phone and then hung up and turned my phone off, so the first thing they would try to do is call me back, and it's not going to answer. So then they would do is they would phone the cell phone company that I'm subscribed with. So I'm on with TELUS. So they'd phone TELUS, and TELUS would say, yeah, it's David Brown, and he lives at this address on this street. He's lived there since this time. This is another contact number for him. This is a family member he put down on his cell phone application. And so then they'd start cross-referencing that. So then maybe if I had a home phone number, then they'd start phoning my home phone. And then they'd probably look at it and say, well, you know what? His Annie Alley was actually right by where his house is. So then a police officer would come knock on the door. So a lot of follow-ups done that way. In this specific case, you know what, in the backcountry, 500 meters is not actually that terrible. And again, they'd probably start doing a lot of researching, try and get in contact with family members so they could say, hey, we just got a 911 call from so-and-so. We think they're in the backcountry. Did they leave you a trip plan? Do you have any other way to contact them? Do they have a spot? Do they have an inReach? Do they have any of the other things? So a 911 call is never going to just get ignored. There is a theoretical limit where they're going to consider that they've done everything they can to follow up on them, but it's quite a large limit, and especially if it's coming from the backcountry. People don't pocket dial from the middle of Garibaldi like we have up on the screen here. It's a very rare occurrence, so it would be followed up on quite heavily.
All right, I think those are all the questions for now.
Yeah, I was just looking at the one here from someone from Canada. So with the lease names, that's not something that we can put in natively. So I can take an intersection, I can just type it right into the computer. It says, yes, that's a place. Or I can take an address and type it right in. I can take 100 block and I can type it right in. I can put a GPS long in there and type in it. I can put a few other weird things in there. Lease numbers are not something that I can just put into my computer. And so literally what I'm doing is I'm going into Google and finding, oil field lease GPS converter, typing in the lease name. And again, it just creates an extra margin of error, because then the caller who's possibly under stress, because the caller is possibly under stress, there's a possibility that they're going to give the lease number wrong to begin with. They're going to mix up a W and a 2, and all of a sudden we're going to a completely different location. And then similarly, there's the possibility for error on the call taker end. There's a possibility for error in a few other places. Yeah, in Northeast BC and STARS as kind of special circumstances. STARS is Shock Trauma Air Rescue Society. It's Alberta's air ambulance who do respond into British Columbia from time to time. And they specifically also provide the ability to book pre-plans through your lease. So if you're working as the site medic at lease XYZ214, you can phone ahead and say, hi, I'm the medic at XYZ214. This is our GPS location. This is our landing zone. This is the details of the work we're doing. So the pre-plan is there. And so that's where the lease information is useful, because STARS has that lease information written down. And so all they can have to do is type the lease number into their computer, and it immediately spits back, yep, this is the lat long. Whereas the lease numbers don't actually translate quite as tidily straight through to a GPS coordinate as people think they do a lot of the time.
There was just one more question that was sent to me in private chat, and it was, can I use landmarks if I don't know an address?
I mean, if we're using landmarks, we're using landmarks to find an address or find a general area. So if you phone in from the middle of a city you don't know, you can't see a street sign, I'm going to basically take the alley that you dropped into. I'm going to put a pin right in the middle of that in Google Maps, and I'm going to go into Street View. And it's as simple as I'm going to start looking around and say, okay, do you see a big tall building with a Batman poster on the side? No? Okay. Do you see a Starbucks with an office tower on top of it? You do? Okay. Is that towards the patient or away from the patient? And we're basically just playing, do you see this? Do you see that? And we'll use that to narrow in. You can really freak people out from time to time, because they'll say, like, are you standing in front of a green house with a yellow fence? And they'll say, oh my God, yes. How did you know? And they're either very impressed or slightly concerned. But so we use landmarks, but it's really working towards finding an address. Because especially in BC, it happened today. I had a crew from Souk, not from Souk. I had a crew from Campbell River ended up in Souk. And so it's people say all the time, oh yeah, I'm at the house by the Ghetto Tire store 2 doors up from the crack shed. The locals will know where it is, just send them. But I had a crew from 4 hours away who've probably never ever been in their lives to Souk, can barely navigate the streets alone, because we watch them drive around in the map and we see exactly how they choose to navigate. They barely know where they're going following streets, let alone the Ghetto Tire shop 2 houses up from the crack shack, right? So landmarks aren't a particularly useful way to just write things down. So we use them to try and find an address. So that's where I'll go into Google Maps and I'll start maybe looking for tire shops in Souk. And I'll go digging through and I'll find 3 tire shops. Okay, what road are you on, or what road are you near? And I'll say here. And okay, and then so that's where I can look and start googling the Street View, and I find the gnarliest looking house, and like, okay, is the crack shack white with a blue roof? And they say yes, it is. And I say, great, you're at 2812 XYZ road. And so we'll use it that way more than for actually providing it. Any other questions about technology, anything like that?
There's one that just popped up from Chris. Is getting location info from children handled differently? Is there a special protocol?
There's not a special protocol. I mean, with anything with kids, you have to handle it differently. Really, with adults, a lot of the time, people's uncertainty or fear comes from not knowing what to do and not knowing what's happening and feeling out of control. And so for adults, really the goal is to, and generally speaking, everybody's handled differently. The goal is really to provide clear directions, clear questions to know exactly what's going on. moving with purpose to try and find out exactly what's happening and make people feel like they're in control and make people feel like they're making a difference in the situation. Kids need to be handled more delicately. Like obviously the first check is, okay, sweetie, what's your address? Okay, you don't know your address? Is there a piece of mail there? Like you have to step them through it maybe in slightly smaller steps before. Like with an adult, I'd say, okay, do you have anything with your address laying around? Whereas we'll start with like a kid. Did you have a piece of mail? No, okay. Does one of your parents have a purse or a wallet? Okay, can you get their driver's license? That like we'll step through basic things all the way up to, okay, take the phone next door, knock on the neighbor's door and tell them you're on the phone with 911 and you need help. So it's not necessarily a specific protocol for it. You just have to be more gentle with them, because if you start bossing kids around too hard, they'll almost always clam up, shut down, or freak out. And those are all bad things when you're trying to find out where somebody is.
Cool. Good questions, guys. That's all of
Yeah,
them for
great
now.
questions. Okay. Well, we'll pause for more questions in a little bit. But now we're going to talk about how ambulance calls are triaged. So I'm going to back up a slide for a second here. Once upon a time, you would phone 911 and the call taker would say, okay, what's wrong? And you would tell them what's wrong and they would say, okay. And they would send you an ambulance. And there's some pretty horrifying call tapes out there of like, my husband's not breathing. Okay, we're sending an ambulance, bye, click, and hanging up. So now what we do is we use the medical priority dispatch system, which is a tool that's designed to provide a standardized and evidence-based assessment of the call, of every call that comes in. It's a series of scripted questions. So the first focus is always going to be on safety. So there's a lot of different types of events that could have a safety concern. So like, for example, with a car crash, the first couple of questions that we're asking about a car crash are going to be things like, okay, are there any chemicals or other hazards involved? Is anybody pinned in the car? Is anybody trapped? For someone who just got in a fight, the first couple of questions are going to be, okay, where's the assailant now? Are there any weapons involved? So safety questions immediately right off the bat. And then it's going to look for priority symptoms. So for MPDS, medical priority dispatch systems, the 4 key priority symptoms that it's most worried about are going to be chest pain, decreased level of consciousness or a patient being not alert, difficulty breathing. So that's any difficulty breathing beyond normal breathing, and serious uncontrolled hemorrhage, which is relative, but that's what they go for. And then once it's really sort of ticked off those immediate concerns, then it'll ask a few more questions specific to the chief complaint. So in the abdominal pain card, a lot of the time, people kind of confuse upper abdominal pain and lower chest pain. So it'll ask the patient explicitly, do you have chest pain or chest discomfort? No, great. Is the patient breathing normally? Yes, great. That way we've kind of got our priority symptoms out of the way. It's unlikely there's going to be a serious external hemorrhage if someone's complaining of abdominal pain. And we're going to ask, is the patient completely alert? So we've got our priority symptoms out of the way. And then we'll ask things like, have they ever been diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm? So an aortic aneurysm is essentially when the very large blood vessel that runs all the way from your heart down into your abdomen, that is about that big around, starts to rip and tear, which is very bad. And so if someone has a history of that before, and then all of a sudden they're having terrible abdominal pain, it starts to paint a picture of that maybe being a more serious call. The questions are designed in theory so that lay people or those people without any medical training are able to understand the questions and ask them. That's not always the case, but that is what it is. And then the standard is for the call taker to read the script verbatim. So we use a tool that basically on the computers that works through the script there. But of all the calls I take, a random selection, typically about 4 to 5% of them are the tapes are randomly pulled and sent off to the International Academy of Emergency Medical Dispatch, which is in Atlanta, I think it is. And they essentially have reviewers who listen to the tapes, compare it to the script, and make sure that I was following the script appropriately. And then I get a review back on a bunch of these calls that have all been sampled. It is a constantly changing tool. About every 3 months, they put out an update that has all kinds of changes in there. And it's all evidence-based. So they do a lot of research and a lot of trials. And it's detailed to the point that they did a huge trial comparing 2 centers, comparing the difference between the answers you get from the phrase, okay, tell me exactly what happened, and okay, tell me exactly what's happened. And they found that tell me exactly what happened got clearer, briefer answers than what's happened. So it's nerdy stuff, but stuff I find fascinating that way. So similarly, once we get into, so any call, they're going to start with the key information. So you have to get an address or location, and you have to get a callback number. And then after that, they're going to move into the MPDFs. So the first thing they're going to say is to open it up. Okay, tell me exactly what happened. And that's where we're going to get the hopefully brief story of what's wrong today. And this can be anywhere from the 80-year-old man saying, my wife has chest pain. Boom, great. We know exactly what's wrong. She has chest pain. Or it can be the 80-year-old man saying, well, in 1945, she stubbed her toe and she had to go to the hospital for that and it was broken. And then when it was broken, she had to see a doctor about something else. And you get a 10-minute story and you come out of it and you're really not actually clear what's wrong in that moment. So that's why we sometimes have to go, focus in and clarify, okay, what's happening today that you're calling 911? What's happening right now? What's changed in the last 4 months of your diarrhea that all of a sudden now you're calling 911? But that's the phrase, that's the question we're going to use to start it off and get the basic idea of what's going on. From there, we're going to get the patient information. So we want to get the patient's age, because a lot of things are going to be different between a 5-year-old having chest pain and a 60-year-old having chest pain. We're going to look at those quite differently. We're going to get the patient's gender, abdominal pain in women. One of our concerns is going to always be something called an ectopic pregnancy. If we ask a male if there's a possibility he's having an ectopic pregnancy, we're going to look a little stupid over the phone. There are the occasional uncomfortable moments where you have a caller that you're speaking to them, like you're talking to the patient themselves, and it's a poor connection and they maybe have a slightly more androgynous voice. And you've really got to make a coin flip about what gender you're putting down. And it does happen every so often, you get it wrong. And then the next key questions, are they awake and are they breathing? And these are two really simple things. And it seems silly to ask them on every single one, but I've had the exact same thing before. Oh, well, she's having chest pain and it's been like this. And like, okay, it's going to be a really straightforward chest pain. Okay, sir, so just to make sure, is she awake? Oh, well, no, actually, she's not awake. Okay, sir, is she breathing? Oh, no, I don't think she's breathing. And so all of a sudden, we've immediately recognized that cardiac arrest. Similarly, we have something called fast tracks. So there's a few extremely serious and very immediately life-threatening concerns that instead of taking down all the other information, as soon from tell me exactly what happened, I can post a call right there and then. So from tell me exactly what happened, if they give me something that makes it seem like they're not conscious and they're not breathing, I can immediately just post a call that says a cardiac arrest, and we can start sending resources that way immediately, and we'll sort out the details later. I'll get the age and the gender eventually somewhere along the line. Similarly for things like drowning, we can send a call immediately from there. If someone's just screaming, he's drowning, he's drowning. A person on fire is another example. We can send a call right from that screen there. I have one button that says person on fire. I've never gotten to use it. But there's that button right there, so we can just send that call immediately. And then the hardest part of call taking, especially when you're new, is you have to take that chief complaint that somebody gave it there, and then you have to pick one of 33 cards that it fits into. And those really provide the clearest, and that's going to select the questions that you're going to ask for you. So these are all the things that we have to pick from. And it seems a little overwhelming. And one of the things is you just have to have these memorized after a while. But you'll start to, leave these up for a minute here just for people to look through. I'm going to check some of these questions here because I see a few popping up and I just want to make sure none of them are immediately relevant. But just read through some of these. And these are all the different things we have to pick from. I'll get to these two questions here in a few minutes because they sort of fit into this whole section here. So we have all of these to pick from, and there's some of them that are a lot more common. So we take a lot of calls from people with abdominal pain. We take a fair number of allergic reaction calls. We take a lot of chest pains. We take a lot of seizures. But then there's other things like the 22 entrapment card. In 2 years, I've used that card once, and that was for a pile of dirt that fell on top of somebody and trapped them there. I don't think I've ever posted an electrocution or a lightning call, but I've posted probably 9 or 10 stabbings or gunshot wounds or penetrating traumas. It's all a little subjective, but you have to find a way to fit it all in there. And so that's where the 26 card, the sick person unwell, really is kind of the catch-all. And so instead of asking any specific questions, so that, if I'm asking questions about a stabbing, my questions are going to be, is there more than one wound? Is the knife still in the wound? Is he still bleeding? Or the back pain, I'm going to ask, what caused the back pain? So was it did you fall 2 weeks ago? Is it just started hurting all of a sudden? And the 26 card is really just designed to be as general and broad as possible. And all it's doing is looking for priority symptoms. So we'll ask, are they completely alert? Are they breathing normally? Are they bleeding or vomiting blood? Do they have any pain? We've asked those 4 questions. We've figured out there's probably no priority symptoms. Great. We're done. We know there's no priority symptoms. We'll send an ambulance when we get to it. So once we've worked through all these questions, then the call taker is going to provide, sorry, I'll get back into it, pre-dispatch instructions and pre-arrival instructions. So this is where they're going to provide instructions to guide the callers, sometimes through life-saving care before the paramedics can arrive. So there are some things like a massive hemorrhage, emergency childbirth, choking management, CPR. All of these are things we can guide callers through doing on the phone using basic, straightforward instructions. So we can actually help somebody before the paramedics arrive. I've delivered a couple babies over the phone now. We do CPR probably 2 or 3 times a day at a minimum. The tourniquets and bleeding application happen quite frequently. I took a call for a motorcycle accident that had a leg amputation a few weeks ago. And exactly that, we were talking people through making a tourniquet out of found materials on the scene there. And then the call takers will always stay on the line with unstable patients. So we are mandated to stay on the line with any serious shortness of breath patient or any patient that is answered as being not alert. But beyond that, it's the call taker's judgment. So really, any patient that is sick or seems acutely unwell, and it seems like there's a chance that they're going to get worse between when we dispatch the ambulance and when the ambulance arrives, the call taker will just stay on the line, because that way they're either able to provide some of these life-saving instructions if the patient deteriorates that much, or they're just able to update the file so that paramedics better understand the kind of call they're walking into. So this is once upon a time, before the computer programs happened, the MPDS system was comprised of a card set that looked just like this. And so what happened was you picked your chief complaint and you flipped it open to the right card, and you had a piece of paper that looked just like this. And so you asked your question. So for example, this is for somebody that has a headache. So we start, are they completely alert? Are they breathing normally? Are they able to talk normally? So our main concern with a headache really is that it could be a stroke. They're just not noticing stroke symptoms. So what we're doing here now, we've asked, are they completely alert? We've asked if they're breathing normally. So those are really our 2 priority symptoms out of the way. So now we're looking for problems more specific to the headache. So now are they able to talk normally? No. Okay, good. Was there a sudden onset of severe pain? A lot of people report a headache that's associated with a stroke, or a headache that's reported with some other major neurological problem, as being a sudden onset of the worst headache they've ever had. So just out of nowhere, this massive worst headache in the world. Those are very worrying words. The same, any numbness or paralysis. So they might not realize, oh, Grandma actually can't feel the left side of her face. She's just complaining about the headache. But when they ask her directly about that, that's when we'll start to recognize, oh, actually, Grandma does have these symptoms. And the same, we'll work through these questions. So can you see my mouse on top of the card right now? Is that coming through? I need a yes or no in the chat here, somebody.
There's a mouse that is moving around.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to make sure I can actually point to where we're going. So what'll happen is we'll work through all of these questions, and now we have to figure out a determinant. And this is where we're going to look through, and you start top to bottom. So the first one, if there's not alert, great. That's going to be a Charlie 1 determinant, so an 18 Charlie 1. If they are alert, but all of a sudden they have abnormal breathing, now it's going to be an 18 Charlie 2. And we work our way down that way. And then all the way up to everything's totally fine. They're breathing normally and they have no symptoms is an 18 Alpha 1. This is a bit of an outdated card, but I couldn't find a good copy of a better one from now. This is just an interest point and is nothing you guys have to understand at all. So we're going to go to a couple sample calls here. So I'm just going to address some questions here. And if anybody has other questions about how these are triaged or how we use these tools, this is a good time for it. So I see one here. Should we just wait until prompted instead of starting to report? I know they have a script and we ask it in order. So that's a great question and something we run into a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about calling 911 on duty later in it. But the short answer is when they say, tell me exactly what happened, I don't want your full handover report. Not in a rude way, I don't care about most of it. I just want to know what's the problem. So if I say, tell me exactly what happened, and you say, Mr. Sorensen is an 85-year-old male with a history of the CVA, a cabbage 5 years ago, and this and this. About 3 o'clock today, he started to have chest pain, but then he ate a churro. So he took some Tums and the Tums kind of made it go away, but he's still having the chest pain and we're kind of concerned about it. His vitals are, blood pressure is one, stop. I will probably cut you off at that point. You're gonna open it with, hi, my name's Chris. I'm from St. John Ambulance. We're the duty medical crew at this event. I'm with an 85-year-old male who has chest pain. Stop. And then from there, just answer the questions they're asking. And if after that, if you really feel that something key has been missed or they didn't ask a question that's relevant to your patient's presentation, then you'll have an opportunity later on to kind of add that in. But right off the bat, you are functionally delaying the person getting care by getting in the way of the call taker doing their job. And again, we'll talk a little bit about it later, so I'm not going to go into too much depth, but especially with a good St. John Ambulance person or a good event first aider, you can get on and off that phone in under 2 minutes, no problem most of the time. So you just answer the questions as asked, keep it simple, and you'll have no problem there. Larry asks a great question that I should have mentioned earlier. Translators. We have access to nearly every language spoken. There's a few out there. We had to get an Urdu translator the other day, and that took quite a while. But generally speaking, it's absolutely correct that we can talk to anyone in almost any language. Sometimes it's a little bit of a mess. Just listening to 3 people all talking back and forth and the same. The translators aren't always medically trained and don't necessarily have the medical vocabulary because they're just part of the provincial government's translation service. They're not specific to 911 or BC ambulance. And similarly, they're not always trained in, they don't have a lot of the training in like calming, de-escalation, and caller control techniques that we have. So a lot of the time it can be more challenging just because you don't have that control over the call. You can't get the information as tidily. But we do have access to it. And so it's a useful thing to mention if you have family members that don't speak English. It's really important that they're able to give their address and say the name of the language that they speak in English. Because that's another thing the queue operator is able to do right at the PSAP level, is if they just get a phone call and all they're getting is Mandarin, 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 they'll get a Mandarin. If someone is saying Mandarin over and over again, they'll get a Mandarin translator on the line right then and there to get the information that way.
There were a few questions that were sent to me directly. I don't know if you want to tackle those now.
Sure, let's go for it.
You were talking about like gender specific questions or sex specific questions. And the person asking the question wants to know, how do they deal with trans people? Do you even ask?
Yes, so this is a topic outside of this and generally in medicine. That's something I'm interested in. The short answer is it generally applies about the same you would with any patient. So generally speaking, with people who are trans, people who identify as gender nonconforming, you kind of have to ask the 2 questions of how do you identify and what are your pronouns? Because that's how you're going to address them and talk to them, because that's who they are. But you also need to be comfortable asking the question of, biologically, what is your sex? And I'm not going to dig into the difference between sex and gender because that's a whole thing. But generally speaking, you need to understand the difference between a trans person's identity and a trans person's physical presentation, because it is fully possible that a trans man who still has a uterus could run into issues around there that are specific to typically female anatomy. MPDS is also really good. Like if you put in unknown for the gender, it gives perfect they them pronouns that way. It's not the tidiest system if you have somebody that identifies as trans but who medically might present as a different gender than their identity. So it's a little bit of a feeling out that way, if that makes sense. The biggest differences for our concerns for gender really come down to women are more likely to have heart attacks younger than men. So our threshold for being concerned about chest pain in women goes to a lower age than it does in men. And then for women, it's abdominal pain related to possible ectopic pregnancies. And again, typically for people who are identifying as gender non-conforming or people who identify as transgender, typically for trans men, there's a lower likelihood of pregnancy related complications. So generally it's something I would probably avoid dealing with, but again, you just sort of have to build some comfort asking the questions and discussing it that way.
Cool. When calling 911 with an update on an ongoing incident that's already been called in, how do we identify that we're doing that? Do we request our call be routed directly to Victoria, BCEHS, or wherever you are?
No. So basically what you'll do is you'll call 911 and you'll say BCM 911, you call police fire ambulance, and you'll say ambulance if you're calling for an update on ambulance call. And then they'll open with BC ambulance for what city, or BC ambulance, what's the address of the emergency? And you'll say, hi, my name's so-and-so with St. John Ambulance. I'm calling for an existing call at address. And you just give the address right there, and that's going to pull up the file that way. So you don't have to talk to the same call taker. You don't have to talk to the same people. Any other call taker can just pull up the ticket right there and start either adding information, modifying the ticket, or reassessing it depending on what's appropriate.
Cool. And the last question I've got is, does ECOM have a recording that they can review conveniently, or is processing required before they can go back and re-listen to something?
Everything is recorded. Every single thing is recorded. If any folks out here, I know there's a few people I recognize from Vancouver Island, even if you phone in on the crew lines just to talk to your dispatcher, if you work for BC Ambulance, that is taped. If you say something stupid on there, I'm going to listen to it out loud to play it for the rest of the center. But no, everything is recorded, and it's one of the advantages and one of the disadvantages of the job is everything's verifiable. If I'm going to lie about something on a taped line, it's taped right there. But when somebody tries to throw me under the bus about something that's said on a taped line, it's right there as well. So yeah, I've spent, especially for disconnected 911 calls, that's where it's really helpful, because a lot of the time, someone will phone 911, they'll make it through to me through the PSAP, and I'll be talking to them, and then halfway through the phone dies, or it hangs up because they get out of cell service, or any number of things. And maybe I was halfway through working on the address because I had a really poor connection. I've sat there for 20 minutes at a time playing the same like 12 seconds of a tape over and over and over, trying to hear something different. So everything is taped, and we can listen to the tapes immediately after the phone call is disconnected. And similarly, the supervisor has a button, and they can just listen in on a 911 line, and they can pull up anybody's tapes as well. So it'll happen from time to time if somebody steps out of the room and we have a question about a call they did and we need to answer it right away. The supervisor will just pull up their tapes and we can play it right there to listen to what was being said.
Cool. All the questions for now. Thanks.
Great. So speaking of tapes, we're going to listen to a couple 911 calls. So I tried to make this smoother, and it's not. So what I'm basically just going to do is play through most of these calls. There's only 2 of them. I'm going to play most of the way through the first call, then I'll point a few things out along the way. And the same, we'll move on to the second call, and we'll point a few things out along the way there. Again, this is just a note. If the idea of listening to something like a 911 call does make you uncomfortable, it's probably time to step away for about the next 10 minutes. We will be back. There's a little bit more afterwards, but just so I've said it out loud.
Hey Dave, there's no audio coming through.
Well, that didn't work, did it? Well, sorry, guys. I guess we're not going to listen to 911 tapes. Um, Sorry, I should have tested that beforehand. Anyways, just a couple notes from there that I'm going to point out from this call of things that would have happened. So this was a cardiac arrest call with a child caller. Sorry, that's completely, it's still burning away in my ears. So this was a cardiac arrest with a child caller, which was quite interesting that way. And otherwise, it's mostly just I wanted to play it so you can actually keep through the process of talking somebody, even a child, through a 911 call. And then the other one was at the opening of it, they're going to say, okay, are you with her now? And they reply, my mom's really sick. And that's a classic issue we run into is we ask a question and get an answer to a completely different question we asked. So we're almost through, and then we'll get to any other last questions coming through. Calling 911 on duty. So MPDS does not differentiate between lay people and medically trained callers. There is an exception if you are a nurse or a doctor who is the regular caregiver of somebody in a care facility. But beyond that, it doesn't matter if you're an emergency physician, a paramedic, a St. John ambulance first responder. Everybody who's calling 911 for a street call is going to be getting asked the exact same questions. And so trying to circumvent answering the questions, or trying to argue with the call taker, or trying to, like I said, answer questions that aren't being asked, all it's going to do is delay you getting help. So that's why you're going to identify yourself early as a medical first responder with St. John Ambulance. When you're on duty, identify yourself clearly as a medical first responder with St. John Ambulance, and answer the questions clearly and with yes or no answers whenever possible. So if they say, are they changing color? The best answer is not going to be, well, he's kind of blue, but then his lips are kind of red. It's like, yes, he's changing color. Does he have a history of heart problems? Oh, well, he said he had an MI. Greg, when did he have an MI? Was it 4 years ago or 5? Yes, he has a history of heart problems. You know you had an MI. And then the last thing too is when you're calling, if you require an ambulance, call 911. Do not call the non-emergency line. I know a lot of people understand the difference between the non-emergency line for police and the emergency line for police. That differentiation isn't there with the ambulance service right now. So we use the MPDS, or priority dispatch system, to determine what's an emergency or not. And that's where the non-emergency phone number that's published out there is really more of an information line. So if you require an ambulance, just call right through on 911. You'll be triaged the same way everybody else is, and go that way. So just as we are moving through, just talking a little bit about the resources that will be sent, because I know this isn't something everybody understands. So in BC, we've functionally got 3 basic levels of ambulance. So there's the basic life support ambulances, which are just the regular ones you see driving around to say emergency paramedic on the side. They're staffed with primary care paramedics, emergency medical responders, people who are trained anywhere from 3 weeks up to 5 months of training. They go to all the calls. Every single call just about will get a primary care or basic life support ambulance. Certain communities also have advanced life support ambulances. So Victoria, Nanaimo, the Lower Mainland, Kamloops, Kelowna, Prince George all have advanced life support ambulances. So these are people who have done an extra 2 years of school. And we'll talk about the actual response model, but we use them really just targeted on the high acuity medical calls. And then we also do have the critical care paramedics, who are advanced care paramedics with an extra 3 years of training. They largely work doing high acuity interfacility transfers. So if you have your heart attack in Fort St. James and you need to get flown to somewhere that has a cardiac specialist, the critical care paramedics might fly up in their plane to pick you up and fly you to Kamloops or fly you to St. Paul from Vancouver. And then they do also respond to scenes largely for serious traumatic injuries. So when we're looking at responding to calls, we can't send ambulances to all the calls. So some of the other tools, BC Ambulance does contract for helicopters and a number of planes. We use those on a lot of typically responding alongside ambulances. but especially the helicopter based out of Kamloops does also do quite a few scene responses into backcountry and into areas that are not as accessible by ambulance. On the island and in BC as well, a lot of the time we'll use military aircraft. So we've had calls in very remote areas that our helicopters aren't able to land in. And so the military have the ability to do long lining and winching and all kinds of extremely cool things that way. And so a lot of time we'll phone them and say, hey, are we able to have you pick this patient up and bring them to us? So we'll work with them from time to time. We frequently work with the Coast Guard and Royal Canadian Marine Search and Rescue, using them either to help us get to smaller islands, especially we dispatch for almost 20 major islands and probably a few hundred smaller islands all up and down the coast of the Vancouver Island here. So we rely heavily on the Coast Guard for assistance getting to and from a lot of those small islands, especially where the ferry infrastructure is not there during the day or overnight when the ferries aren't running. And similarly, ground search and rescue, we work with them a lot. So just getting back to MPDS for a few moments here, it spits out a series of determinants. And so they're from lowest priority, it's omega, to echo is the highest priority. And it goes, omega, alpha, bravo, Charlie, delta, echo. Works mostly in a linear setup that way. So the echo calls are, like I mentioned, those ones that we're sending immediately to get help us there as fast as possible. And so it's going to be cardiac arrest, overdose, person on fire, drowning, major electrocutions, things like that. And a lot of other jurisdictions, especially in the United States, send everything in the kitchen sink to echoes. So a lot of US postal vans, for example, have an AED on board. So they'll phone over the post office and say, hey, you have a postal van in this neighborhood? And they'll say, yes. And they'll say, great. And the first person busting down the door for cardiac arrest is a postie with a CPR certificate and an AED. Similarly, a lot of other agencies will explore using police, city workers, anything like that on echoes. It's not something we do here, but even during COVID, the echoes are one of the only determinants that we're consistently sending, the fire department on as well, while we're trying to reduce use of first responder and fire department resources due to COVID. And then the omega calls are, generally speaking, calls that are not going to be receiving an ambulance response. So we've screened them really carefully, and we're confident there's really nothing that requires an ambulance. So these are some great examples: toothaches, muscle cramps, the 3-year-old that put a piece of Lego up their nose. These are all things people call 911 for, all things that we try and explore opportunities to deal with otherwise. And I'll talk about that in a second here. So we then take the MPDS determinants and apply them to the clinical response model. And that's our color-coded system of applying the calls. Generally speaking, it works pretty tidily. So the echoes are purples, the deltas are reds, the Charlies are yellows, the Charlies are oranges, the yellows are alphas, and the omegas are blues. So the echoes and the reds, or the purples and the reds, are going to get an advanced life support ambulance if it's available, a primary care paramedic ambulance, and the purple calls will also get the fire department. So we're basically throwing everybody at it, lights and sirens, as fast as we can. The orange calls, there's probably nothing to be concerned about, but there's enough we're a little worried. So that's when we'll send just the primary care paramedic ambulances, code 3. So with their lights and sirens on. The yellow calls, it's a routine call. So a sprained ankle, I've been vomiting for 2 days, I've had a headache for a few days, I cut my finger, but it's not bleeding, but I think I need stitches, that kind of thing. And those are routine calls, and about 70% of the calls we do take are routines. For the omegas, we do have a couple other tools we use. So the blue calls, we pass along to HealthLink BC, 811, or BC Nurse Line, depending on what year you grew up in, or poison control. Both of those are great resources, and we'll basically say, look, we don't think this needs an ambulance. And then that's where the experts there will just gain a little more information. Poison control are awesome. They know everything about everything. HealthLink's really good at finding alternatives, saying, hey, why don't you stay at home and we'll call you in a few hours and see how you're doing. And the same BC Ambulance also is using some registered nurses to call back some lower priority calls just to explore alternatives. So say, hey, you don't really need an ambulance. Could you drive yourself to the hospital? Could you take a taxi to the hospital? Could you see your family doctor tomorrow? just finding some that way. So that's really all I have to talk about here. I didn't fill out my references as much as I want to. We do have lots of opportunity for questions. I'm here for at least the next 2 hours. We've got lots of these events coming up. We are doing these every Monday night. We've got some really great speakers coming up in the next few weeks, and I'll let Anna introduce those. If other people do have questions now, this is a great time to ask about anything we've covered in here, anything related to dispatch, 911 calls, whatever you want to talk about.
A couple questions that came up. There was one from Peter, and he's asking, how about a approved third-party medical requesting ambulance through a pre-authorized SEN protocol? Do they have to report through MPDS? A lot of call takers aren't aware of this protocol.
We don't use SEN protocol in BC, which is the short answer. So it would still be triaged through MPDS because that's not something that's not a tool we use.
Easy answer. Someone says you send some Omega calls to poison control, but that can be life-threatening.
I'm not frankly sure what this person's referring to. We screen them quite carefully, so we're making sure that it's an exposure that has happened typically at least a few hours ago without any symptoms. And similarly, we pass them on to poison control, and poison control does more of their screening, and they also know better the toxicology. So they're going to go through exactly what this person might have consumed, and they're able to do better screening. And so a lot of the time they will refer calls back to us and say, hey, actually, we think this person needs an ambulance. And sometimes they'll even phone up and say, no, we think this person needs an ambulance, lights and sirens. And we do it that way. Generally speaking, if a call is if a call is an Omega call, it's not a life-threatening call. It's been carefully screened by us to be quite sure that it's not a life-threatening call that doesn't require an ambulance response. By no means do all poisoning calls go through to poison control.
Yeah, she's just clarifying that she was wondering why they're not given a higher priority.
Yeah, and it's because there are no priority symptoms. So it's things like, my 2-year-old just drank 2 times their dose of cough syrup for the night by accident. The kid's fine. They just really need to make sure that it's going to be okay. So that's where we screen it and we make pretty sure, yeah, this kid's fine. They don't have any symptoms. There's nothing we're concerned about. So then we'll pass the call to poison control, because then poison control can just do a little extra screening. They can ask about other medications the child's on that might have interactions. They just know more about it that way. So it's more a second line of defense on calls that are already a very low priority. And the same, a lot of the time, it just keeps people from having to go to the emergency room to sit there and then have the doctor phone poison control and say, hi, my name's Dr. So-and-so. I have a 3-year-old who took this, and this. Are you concerned about it? Because a lot of the calls that poison control takes do come from physicians and doctors and healthcare facilities already.
All right.
Yeah, so this note from, I think it's Marion, forgive me if that's wrong. Yeah, so again, poisonings with any breathing issues, poisonings with neuros, poisoning with any symptom whatsoever is immediately going to get an ambulance. That's not something we would route to poison control, and that's something we give a higher priority. It's not all poisonings are passed to poison control. That's a great clarification. And then calling 911 from a satellite phone. Great question, and that's something I didn't cover and I should have. So if you're calling from either a satellite phone or you have a VoIP phone, so like you have one of the cell phones that doesn't actually connect to cell towers but just goes over Wi-Fi, or you're calling from like a Google Voice number or a phone number on your laptop, that's not actually part of the 911 system. So those are all answered by an organization called Northern 911 based in Ontario. And they have a huge database that contains every single emergency call center in North America. So what'll happen is your phone company, your sat phone company, or your web phone company routes the call through to them, and then they'll get the address, and then they have technology that works with the virtual phones or the satellite phones that gives them the phone number, and then they'll connect you through to the appropriate answering service. So a lot of the time we'll get a phone call and it opens with, hi, this is operator 23621 from Northern 911. I'm transferring you a ThinkTel VoIP caller. with an address of this and a phone number of that. So they're professionals and they're really, really good at their job, but it does add an extra step, and it can take an extra couple minutes sometimes to get connected through that way.
There was a question a bit earlier from Kyra. She's asking how many call takers are on duty at a given time, and what happens if and when they get to a point where everyone's on the phone but calls keep coming in.
Yeah, so I don't know the exact numbers on call takers, so I don't want to give you, this many. For Victoria, at our lowest, we have 2 call takers between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. We have 2 call takers, 2 dispatchers, and a supervisor, all the way up to, I think our peak is 10 call takers fully staffed during a day shift. And then I don't know the exact numbers for the other centers. I think we typically average 25 call takers when we're fully staffed across the province. And then I'm just going to jump back a whole bunch of slides here to my map with all the 3 centers. So what happens is each center has its own area of responsibility. And so when you call 911, first your call gets put through to the center that you're in. So if you're calling from Victoria, first you'd be put through to the Victoria Center. And then if all of a sudden the Victoria Center didn't have any available call takers, but the computer saw that Kamloops did, it'll take the call back and put it through to a call taker in Kamloops. The queue operator from the PSAP stays on the line with you, like they're in the background until you're connected through to the ambulance service. But sometimes when there's no call takers available, you end up on hold. And it's a pre-recorded message that says, you've reached the BC ambulance emergency line. All call takers are currently taking other calls. Stay on the line, do not hang up. And then the queue operator is staying on the phone with you. Don't hang up, sir. We're connecting through to the ambulance. Stay on the phone, stay on the phone. But it does unfortunately happen. Last year, I guess it must have been, there was a major incident with a transit bus, a tourist bus, and 2 pedestrians in downtown Vancouver. And I think we ended up counting that we got nearly 80 calls in 2 minutes on this one event because it's in the middle of downtown Vancouver. So there's people standing right next to it that have great information, and there's people on the top of office buildings looking down that just see a bunch of people clustering together and they're not really sure what's wrong. And so obviously at that point, our 20 call takers are completely overwhelmed by all of this. And so people end up on hold. It's unfortunate. And I never like to see it when calls go on hold, but it does happen from time to time.
All right. Someone's asking, how are mental health emergencies handled?
I mean, there is the MPDS card for psychiatric and abnormal behavior. It's not great. It's really focused on identifying someone that's an immediate risk to themselves, essentially with active suicidal ideation or actively a risk to others around them or themselves. So someone who's actively self-harming, someone who is behaving threateningly towards other people. It's not a comprehensive mental health assessment, and it's not really designed to replace it. So a lot of people whose main problem is more chronic mental health conditions that don't have the immediacy or the acuity of saying I'm feeling suicidal today, but they're just my anxiety is really high right now, and like I've had these thoughts about suicide, but I know I don't want to follow through with it. I don't have the intent. A lot of those people end up talking to HealthLink BC Nurse Line. They're actually a really great resource for mental health, if nothing else, because a lot of the time people aren't always calling 911 because they want an ambulance to take them to the hospital, especially around mental health. But they're really looking more for somebody that they're able to talk through and help understand what they're feeling with. Similarly, we do also have this safety screening questions in there. So we do ask, is somebody violent? Do they have a weapon? Things like that. And then once we've gotten through that, we'll get more calls. A lot of the time, if someone is calling for themselves or they're with a friend and they're saying, hey, I'm feeling suicidal right now. I need help. I need to go to the hospital. They recognize it's a problem. They're calling themselves. They're asking someone to call. They're calm. They want to go to the hospital. Great. We're just going to send the ambulance. They'll pick them up and take them to the hospital. But there are also calls we have to send the police on as well. And that's largely when either we're not able to confirm that there isn't a safety risk to the crews. So we're not able to speak to that patient directly, or we're getting third-hand information from somebody else. Or for whatever reason, the call taker feels that there is a threat presented in that call, or it might not be safe for the crews. Does that answer the question? If someone was asking a totally different tangent of that and I went off about something else, let me know and I can clarify.
In the meantime, Kevin's asking, after dispatching, do you ever get to find out how the call is resolved?
Oh, not nearly enough. And it's kind of one of those things, and it's almost the hardest part, because a lot of the time, like, we can train non-paramedics to use our triaging tools quite regularly, and they maybe don't necessarily understand all the questions they're asking. They don't get the medical logic behind all of it, but they're still able to effectively triage calls and answer that way. And so as a paramedic, I'm sort of asking the questions and listening to the story. And a lot of the time I'm kind of putting together a picture in my head of what's actually going on. So I really try and follow up on some of the calls I take, especially the ones I'm interested in. But a lot of the times it's just not practical, because you've got to have, you know, the paramedic crew phone up afterwards or that kind of thing. When I'm dispatching, I work hard to try and follow up for the call takers that have questions about it or think it was something or calls we were discussing. But the other thing too is it does sort of get to the point where after a while, a little bit of the novelty of, you know, did I get this right or not, starts to go. When I was brand new, I wanted to follow up on every single call because I had to know, and it does start to fade. Whereas now you just start to, you know, for me, it's more the like operationally unique or interesting situations. A few days ago, we had a structure fire, and then about 10 minutes, or sorry, about 2 minutes after the structure fire call came from the fire department, we had somebody pushing their lifeline pendant. We got the call from Lifeline, and we phoned Lifeline and we couldn't get through. And so we had to send the ambulance just to go check on the structure fire and make sure the fire department was okay and all that. And after they cleared, then we sent them to check on this medical alert, and they phoned up and said, well, this medical alert you sent us, it's actually the address of the fire. Like the address we had on the ticket for the fire itself was a little up. And it turns out this guy had just been mashing his help button on his Lifeline, trying to get anybody to come because his house was on fire. So it's just the operationally interesting stuff like that I tend to follow up on more now, versus the clinical stuff, except for like the truly weird ones.
Glenn's asking, how many PCPs end up in dispatch or the other way?
Typically, right, the way it's going right now, they are moving more towards hiring external employees, so non-paramedic employees, into dispatch versus paramedics. I think our average class, like our last class, was out of 8. We had 2 PCPs who were already working for us, and everybody else was not paramedics. The class before, I think it was 3 out of 9. So it's a relatively small percentage. Once upon a time, dispatch was staffed entirely with paramedics, and it's not that way anymore, especially as, you know, in the more junior areas or teams.
All right, everyone, if you have any questions, ask them now. We'll hang out for a few more minutes. Otherwise, let me just pull up my calendar here. So if you tune in next week, we will have Lieutenant Bobby Brown presenting. She is with the 11th Field Ambulance here in Victoria. She's also a registered nurse with Island Health. She will be presenting on mass casualty incidents and triage. So we'll be sending that invitation out pretty soon. So tune in for that. For those of you who may be new to this and want to be added to our mailing list, you can email me directly and I'll add you to our weekly emails. Otherwise, David has popped our social media information on the screen. Follow us at SJVicBC for all kind of updates and things like that. And yeah, again, if you have those questions, throw them up here. We'll stick around for a little bit. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evenings.